Awesome, Ethan. Thank you so much for that phenomenal case, and what a great learning opportunity for all of us from that. I'll kind of open it up to the panel for additional questions. But just one quick thing, these complications or the complication of annular rupture is so hard to study systematically. And just because they're so variable in who develops them and how they present and how to manage them. Has there been kind of in your mind a framework for all of us to kind of follow in terms of who are the highest risk patients for annular rupture?
And unfortunately, it's as you said, well, I should say, fortunately, it's a very rare occurrence, but it means that there's not a lot of literature about this. I think it's a lot of the cases that we worry about with heavy calcium in the annulus or with an STJ that's sort of on the smaller side. Those are all what sort of raise my concern for it. But I think that, this is obviously a very painful case and a hard case to share, but I think what it shows is really all the different consequences that can happen from the annular rupture, and that, individually those consequences can be managed sort of rapidly in a percutaneous fashion. It's obviously not going to save everyone, but that is a potential sort of means to saving some patients with this horrendous complication.
I think from your case, Ethan, which is just great. Thanks for sharing your pain with us. Boy, that when I see that, I'm going to think about an aortogram as a first step.
Mm-hmm.
I think the aortogram will tell you a lot about the coronaries, the ascending aorta, in addition to PVL, anything like that. I think that was just a beautiful example. Other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, Ethan, I think you presented last year at CVI a great case of ascending aorta where you did have the same complication, but I think you put the graft in place. Going forward, do you think there's a need for technology like that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, if there was a stent graft that could stent the ascending aorta, that could reach consistently from femoral axis, that is something that would be a great choice. And you're right, that case I showed last year, we used a AAA extender, which is short. I believe it's a 55 or 60 centimeter delivery system. So that had to be delivered with via carotid access, which is something that we do as our preferred alternative access strategy for TAVR. So we're familiar with it, but this patient was just too unstable to entertain that possibility. So yes, if there was some sort of ascending aorta stent graft, I think that would definitely have a role in a case like that.
So Ethan, I've never had to deploy these extenders. What French isn't required?
I can't remember off the top of my head. It's quite big. I believe it's 20 something, but it definitely requires a surgical cut down on the carotid artery to do it.
Okay.
I believe it's 24, Guggen.
Any other comments from the panel or discussions about any of the other cases that we presented today or we talked about?
I think one comment, Ethan, that was a great case. Thanks for sharing that with us. We can always learn from cases like that. And I think that a very important part of the educational piece of this case is the fact that a lot of operators just don't pay attention too often to the sinotubular junction. We look at, protrusion of the calcium in the LVOT, and that's as we know, it's a great predictor of annular rupture. But I think this case illustrates very nicely that we do have to pay attention to all of those structures. And the STJ is something that we really have to be careful with. Very often we have protruding calcium in the STJ that, is going to be a problem with the balloon expandable valve. So thank you for sharing this case. It was just a great case. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's also particularly relevant as we're going higher and higher with our deployments. I mean, we use the loosened line technique. We shoot for a 90-10 deployment. And I think that's all well and good to reduce pacemaker rates, but it does, I think, threaten the sinotubular junction in some cases. So there is a penalty for it in some cases.
Ethan, forgive me. This was an ultra valve that was implanted?
Yeah, this was an S326 Ultra.
So anything to take from that? I mean, clearly undersizing or going under with an overinflating the balloon versus the other way around, taking out volume. When we look at these cases, I mean, there's so many nuances to TAVR now. and clearly treatment algorithm. But anything from an ultra standpoint that you think about?
We've been using Ultra for a while now, and I mean, I don't find it behaves any significantly differently than the traditional S3. In our group, we generally don't really believe in these sort of -1, -2, +1, +2. We just deploy nominally in most cases, and then we'll post-dilate, of course, if need with additional contrast, but we don't like to sort of do volume sort of micro adjustment. I think in this case, had I recognized the higher risk for annular rupture, I would have used a different valve type, likely a Lotus in this day and age.
That's a good question. So for the group, I mean, I tend to use Lotus or a self-expanding approach if there's a nodule, and I tend to think of a 4 or 5 millimeter nodule as somewhat of a concern. What do other people use in terms of their cutoffs for calcification that may favor a self-expanding or Lotus versus a balloon expandable?
So we routinely use self-expanding for patients who have asymmetric bulky calcium. If there's LVOT calcium that's significant. I have to be honest though, in this case, I probably would have used what you did. I think your valve selection was appropriate. You showed it was a very elliptical valve and the largest dimension of the annulus was 27. So I would have found it very hard for me to pick a 23 S3 Ultra. You definitely have to put two more in there and you probably still end up with some leaks. So I think your valve choice was appropriate. One question and comment, we routinely are watching the pressure gauge. Is that something people are commonly doing? I try very hard not to get past 5 or 6 ATs, but certainly in a case where I have concern or if there's a concern about the STJ, I would even be on the lower side.
So what do you do, Andrew, in that case, if you're at like 6 atmospheres and your valve isn't fully expanded, how do you address that?
If you reach 6 atmospheres and you feel that the valve is not fully expanded? Yeah, so I do find that going back in, I think there's a lag time in inflation. And I find that usually once you hit 6 ATs, if you just hold your pressure, you'll see a little bit of give in the gauge. So if you go with a slow deployment, you can probably squeeze in another half cc or so to get you back to 6 ATs. So a very slow controlled deployment sometimes allows you to inflate a little more. If you still feel that you're under deployed and you've got a big leak, I would come in with maybe like a Z-Med or something, not super aggressive, not a true balloon necessarily, and just hit it again.
I actually, honestly, I've never really thought about that. I mean, we all know that the risk of rupture really goes up around 7 atmospheres or 8 atmospheres or more. I've actually never really thought about it. I've always thought about just giving the full volume or subtracting the volume when starting. Anybody else try that? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think what we do here, whenever there is any potential risk for annular rupture, I think we just go with non-balloon expandable valve. I don't really believe people use TE guided, very slow inflation, observe the mobilization of calcium. I think it's just much easier to go with and safer to go with a self-expandable or a mechanically expandable valve. I don't think this magical algorithms work. I think I would just go with a self-expandable valve that works very great and delivers great results.
I think the proviso as well, though, I agree, self-expanding most likely with STJ calcium, but I think that everyone watching should understand about pre-BAV versus post-BAV after the valve is deployed, because the same issue, if you're going to post-dilate of a self-expanding valve with STJ, obviously you're going to run into the same problem. So I think there is something to be said that if you're going to put in a self-expanding, understand the mechanics behind it and that your expansion may be dependent on a pre-BAV.
Absolutely. I think you also need to be willing to tolerate some paravalvular leak at the expense of BAV, because we have definitely run into issues where we'll put in a self-expanding in a sort of high-risk case and then post-dilate it, and then post-dilation that gets us into trouble.
Yeah, those are very good points. I agree. I think when we're planning, when we're going in a case, right, I think we should plan what the expectations are for the case, considering the anatomy of the patient, right? And what's going to be the strategy, right? So imaging is never the final product, right? The final product is going to be the reaction you're going to have in the room based on the imaging assessment that you performed before. It's the same story when people do IVUS and OCT and they don't know how to react to the information and they have wrong reactions and catastrophic scenarios, right? So I think it is important to plan the procedure accordingly. It's just not picking which valve we're going to use, but what's going to be the strategy. And if we have paravalvular leak, what's the cause of that? And should we post-dilate, as Ethan mentioned? I think we have to be cognizant and careful on how we're going to react to and plan the procedure, the full procedure accordingly from A to Z.
I think the other point that shouldn't go unnoticed was your last point on the slide, Ethan, was having a discussion with the patient about what to do in the event that something happens. And that's something I've started documenting as of a couple of years ago as well, about whether they would want an emergent sternotomy. Because, you know, technically, if you declare somebody as high surgical or prohibitive surgical risk, you shouldn't be doing a sternotomy on them unless they expressly want you to open them up. And so I think that documentation ahead of time is very, very important. And I can see now why you went to the lengths that you did to try to save the patient without emergency surgery. Other thoughts or comments from the panel? Gagan, anything else?
No, this was a great session. I think I always, whenever the email comes through, if you want to be part of a complication session, I always wonder if Paul's thinking I just have way too many complications or what it is. But I definitely learn a lot from all of these cases, and I can't thank you guys enough for presenting these, because it basically, I think it expands, and everybody who's on the live session here, you know, it just expands our memory banks, and it allows us to see more. And the more and more you see, the more and more you're able to, when you do get one, it's not a matter of when, it's just you are going to get one. And when you do get one, you have a larger memory bank, and from the collective experience here, it kind of prepares us to potentially, you know, salvage or figure out what the mechanism is and treat the patient as well.
And I think along those lines, I think that's really why we wanted to spend a day on complications here at CVI, because these are rare events. They're uncommon, so it's very difficult to train and prepare for them when they happen, and they'll happen unexpectedly. And so having a good fund of knowledge with weighted and well-developed algorithms is very, very important to address these. And so I hope all of you have learned something, and all of you attending have learned something. And again, want to thank you all for being a part of CVI 2020, and look forward to seeing you today and tomorrow, and also next year in Austin. Next year we'll be in Austin, Texas. So
Wow.
looking forward to it, and hope you all have a good rest of the day.